YouTubers need the right camera, but believe me, you don't have to break the bank to find the perfect camera. I've got the perfect camera options for you right here in this video, whether you're vlogging, gaming, reviews, fitness, or any kind of YouTube content out there. Also, you'll see links in the description down below for the best pricing and the most up-to-date pricing on all the products that we talk about today. Alright, so first up on this list is the most affordable camera on the market right now, and that is the Canon T7. Despite being a budget camera, it actually offers great image quality. It has phenomenal colors right in camera, so you basically don't need to do any editing. Faces and skin tones look alive and fresh because of that amazing color science, and it captures sunsets and tricky color situations very accurately. It will look just as good on camera as it does to you in real life. It has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is the same sensor that you actually see in more expensive cameras that are $600 and $800 like the Canon M50 and the Canon 80D. Often budget cameras can have this low resolution pixelated look that completely destroys your video. But because of the high resolution 24 megapixel sensor in the T7, that is not an issue. But I do want to mention, even though this is a video about YouTube cameras, this camera does take photos at 3 frames per second, and I just want to let you guys know because most likely you'll be using this camera for YouTube thumbnails or social media needs. And as for the actual video itself, it delivers full HD resolution at 24 and 30 frames per second, which is exactly what most YouTubers need. Sadly, there is no slow motion option in this camera, and there is no 4K option, but that's okay. This is like the #1 budget option. We do have 4K and slow motion for you later in this list. But one thing that I do have to mention is that the autofocus is fast and reliable when you use it in the photo mode and you specifically use the eyepiece to get focus. But where the autofocus does suffer is video mode. It's a little slow and unreliable, but if you're someone on a budget, this is still a great video camera. You can easily manually focus your lens or simply use something known as quick mode, where it switches over to the viewfinder to catch focus and then goes back to the LCD. It's a little slow, but it's a lot better than not having this great camera. And one thing that is super important when it comes to YouTube videos, it's the audio. This camera unfortunately does not have an input for external audio. Now the internal audio is pretty good as long as you're no more than 3 to 4 feet away from this camera. Overall, it's a well-built and solid camera body with minimal buttons and menus. Even if you're new to cameras, you can easily pick this camera up and get great results. This is a great budget and beginner camera for someone that's just starting to shoot YouTube videos, that's just starting to get into cameras. But the lack of external audio and autofocus issues might be a deal breaker for some of you. But have no fear, I've got you covered. Let's talk about the next camera that's going to solve a lot of these issues. So if you want something smaller, maybe something pocket-sized so you don't have to be stuck in studio recording all the time, and you want this camera to have really good autofocus, let's check out the G7X Mark III. The G7X Mark III is probably one of the most popular YouTube and vlogging cameras in recent history for tech and YouTube, simply because it has a lot of the things that YouTubers need. The G7X Mark III is incredibly small and durable. It's perfect for someone who's always on the go. The design and autofocus are really special on this camera. First of all, this thing is teeny tiny. Plus, it has a flip-up screen with touch autofocus and touch controls, which make operating this camera super easy, especially for someone that's always on the go. Using this camera is about as complicated as using a smartphone. Plus, it also has an input for external audio, which means you can use a shotgun mic or a wireless mic with this camera to get even better audio. However, what really sets this camera apart from other point-and-shoots besides the price is the 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor, which has phenomenal Canon colors that require, again, almost no editing, but it has this really spectacular built-in lens with a really fast aperture. It has a variable aperture between f1.8 and 2.8 and a focal length between 24 all the way to 100 millimeters, which means you can get wide shots, close-up shots, even macro shots, all with the built-in lens. And because of that fast aperture, this camera is really great in low light, and it also gives you that blurry background look, which we all want, cinematic. Now, as for the actual YouTubing, aka the video, this camera does 4K in both 24 and 30 frames per second, which is such a win for vloggers and content creator. This camera is going to give you video that are leagues better than any other 4K point and shoot out there. And this camera also does up to 120 frames per second in full HD for 5 times slow motion. Slow motion is really useful to make things look epic or for those montage sequences. The G7X Mark III is actually an amazing camera for YouTube thumbnails because this camera shoots a ridiculous 20 frames per second. That is fast enough to shoot anything you want. Sports, action, dance, anything fast moving. 20 frames per second basically means you'll never miss the shot. And if you want to save a little bit of cash, there's also its little brother, the G7X Mark II. This camera is cheaper, but it's missing a few key features. For one, it doesn't have 4K, it doesn't do 120 frames per second, it only does 60, but most importantly, it does not have an input for external audio, but the inboard audio is still rock solid. The G7X Mark III or Mark II is a great beginner YouTube camera and a great beginner vlogging camera. It's a compact camera and it pretty much has everything that a YouTuber or a content creator needs to get started right away. Alright guys, so before we jump into the pro cameras, I quickly want to take a minute and tell you guys about an exciting new product. I find it works great for me when I'm doing video calls and meetings. Plus, it also has a lot of the same features that you would normally find in high-end video cameras, and that is the Lumina 4K webcam. It's the world's first AI-powered 4K webcam. This camera can help you look good and sound good anytime, anywhere. And that's because it uses software and the latest advancements in artificial intelligence to give you top-tier video quality. And all of this without needing any expensive or bulky specialized hardware. It enhances your lighting, natural colors, and creates a stunning depth of field effect, which gives you that professional camera look. But best of all, the cameraman feature is a special feature powered by AI that intelligently tracks you as you move around to make sure that you're always in frame. The software supports both Mac and PC. So if you're looking to enhance your video calls for client meetings or sales calls, this webcam will help you look your best and sound your best. Make sure to check out the link down below for an extra exclusive $25 off your order. The only thing really missing in the G7X series is a larger sensor to get a more cinematic, more professional YouTube look. And if that is something you want, the next two cameras are probably exactly what you're looking for. Let's start with the Canon M50. The Canon M50 is almost the perfect beginner and budget YouTube camera, except for one thing that might be a deal breaker for some of you. Now, it is compact so that you can easily travel with this camera. It's always ready if you're on the go. The image out of the M50 is spectacular. Again, because of those Canon colors, you almost need to do zero editing to the colors in this camera. The M50 has everything that you love about Canon cameras, but it has the horsepower of a high-end camera. Plus, it adds all of the modern bells and whistles that were missing in the Canon T7. The Canon M50 actually has a side articulating screen, which is great for filming not only yourself, but it's also great for filming at high angles and low angles. And the side articulating screen is also a touchscreen which allows for touch controls and touch autofocus. And the Canon M50 also has phenomenal autofocus. Not only does it have intelligent face tracking, but it also has intelligent object tracking. And on top of that, it's got the excellent Canon design, minimal buttons, minimal menus, everything's simple to understand and simple to use. Plus, it also has an input for external audio for all my content creator and YouTubers out there. This camera is extremely user-friendly, just like the Canon T7. It's a great choice for someone who's new to cameras or is just starting out. The Canon M50 has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is the exact thing that's going to help give you that professional high-end YouTube look. In terms of video, this camera shoots full HD at 24 and 30 frames per second, but it also does slow motion at 60 frames per second for 2 times slow motion. Now it does have 120 frames per second for 5 times slow motion. That is like super slow-mo, but it only does that at 720p, which doesn't look as sharp as full HD resolution, but in a pinch, it's a nice thing to have. Now the Canon M50 does do 4K at 24 frames per second, but the 4K is pretty much pushing this camera to its very limits. So in 4K mode, your sensor actually crops in. Basically, you get this huge zoom on your image overall, which makes getting wide shots really difficult, and it's not very good for getting vlogging shots. But the biggest problem in 4K mode is that the spectacular autofocus becomes really slow and kind of unreliable. I think it's really nice to have 4K mode in this camera for special needs cases, but for the most part, I don't think I would use it simply because of that slower autofocus. And also something that I do have to mention is that the Canon M50 also shoots photos in 14-bit RAW at 10 frames per second. This is a really great camera for getting social media photos and YouTube thumbnails, which basically makes the Canon M50 a really good package camera for someone that wants to do everything with one device as long as you're only shooting in full HD and maybe the occasional shot in 4K. But what if you want 4K? What if you want the best camera possible in this price category? In that case, let's talk about the Sony ZV-E10. Not only because it's one of the best YouTube and content creation cameras that you can get right now, but also because it is a phenomenal budget camera. This camera does so much for the price. But here's the thing, because it's such a good camera, it's actually sold out in most places. But don't worry, I'm not gonna leave you hanging, which is why we're gonna talk about the Sony A6100 and A6400 on top of the ZV-E10. These cameras only have minor differences between them, so all three cameras actually have the exact same sensor, which is a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. But what makes this sensor really unique compared to the Canon sensors is the fact that Sony has really good low light capabilities in their sensors. Most cameras top out at about 3200 ISO, but the Sony cameras are pretty clean even as high as 10,000 or 20,000 ISO. To go from 3200 to 10,000 ISO or 20,000 ISO is a pretty big jump. These cameras pretty much see in the dark. And all three cameras shoot somewhere between 10 to 11 frames per second, which not only makes it a great YouTube thumbnail camera, but also a great sports and action camera. But the autofocus in Sony cameras is what makes these cameras really special. If Canon is 9 out of 10, then Sony is 15 out of 10. Sony cameras have intelligent face and object tracking that is normally reserved for much more expensive cameras. On top of that, the focus acquisition speed for these cameras is lightning fast. It is almost impossible not to have your video or photos in focus. Speaking of video, let's talk about the 4K in this camera. This is probably the best 4K that you can get right now at this price point. It does 4K at 24 frames per second with no crop, and there's a teeny tiny crop at 30 frames per second. Now honestly, this crop is barely noticeable and it's nowhere near as bad as the Canon M50 crop. But what makes the 4K really special is that the 4K is actually downsampled from 6K, so that it has much more detail when compared to other 4K cameras. Basically, you're getting the quality of 6K in a 4K package. And it also does 120 frames per second at full HD for 5 times buttery smooth slow motion. And it also does full HD at 24, 30, 60 frames per second, which is pretty standard in most of these cameras. But not only that, the Sony ZV-E10 and the A6400 actually have professional cinema profiles built right in, so that you can really get a professional level color grade in your videos. However, when it comes to the physical design of these cameras, that's when you're really going to start to notice a difference. The bodies are all small and compact, which is exactly what you want from a YouTube camera. The button layout is pretty simple and easy to understand, but the menu system in this camera is kind of complicated and takes a little bit of time to understand and figure out what everything does. Sony tends to focus more on high-end pro cameras, so they've never really invested in making their cameras user-friendly like Canon. Now, the biggest difference that you'll actually see between the Sony A6100, A6400, and the ZV-E10 are actually the button layout. The A6100 and the A6400 come from Sony's professional line, and they have a lot more buttons, a lot more mode dials, a lot more things that professionals would want to use. The ZV-E10 is specifically made for beginners, content creators, and YouTubers, so the button layout is far more minimal. But the Sony ZV-E10 has two things that the A6100 and the A6400 are lacking. One, the ZV-E10 has a really good onboard internal microphone. You almost don't need to get an external microphone with the ZV-E10. The internal microphone is just that good. And the ZV-E10 actually has a side articulating screen similar to that of the Canon M50. Now, one thing to mention is that while the Sony cameras do have touch functionality, it is nowhere near close to the Canon M50 or really any of the Canon cameras. But overall, you're really not missing out on a whole lot if you end up picking up the Sony A6400 or the A6100 versus the ZV-E10. Now, I do love the design on the ZV-E10, but if you want to get started now, if you want to make great videos now, I always say, don't wait, get whatever camera you can get your hands on. So if you don't have a camera, I highly recommend picking up the A6100 or the A6400. And if you already have a camera, but you just want to upgrade, I do recommend waiting up for the ZV-E10 because this camera does have spectacular design specifically for YouTubers and content creators. So I review tons of cameras on this channel and I absolutely love this stuff. But what really matters if you want to get great photos and videos, it's how you use your camera, even if that camera is a smartphone. That's why I created a free training video that shows you how to use your camera to its full potential with my 7 simple secrets that will help you improve your photos and videos today. I put a link in the description down below, so be sure to check that out. If you have any questions about the camera gear we talked about today or the free training, make sure to hit me up in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to you. With that being said, I'll either see you in the next video or in the free training. Peace.